Now that we've learned about procedures and parameters, we are going to learn about the other type of subprogram called functions. So previously we've seen this slide where we said procedures don't return a value and can have parameters, whereas functions return a value and have at least one parameter. Now we understand what we understand what parameters are now. So in this video we're primarily going to be looking at return values because that is what makes a function a function. So let's first think about why we need to return values. So let's say you calculate a value that you need to use later in your subprogram. And previously we've pretty much just been printing our values, but maybe it's a calculation you actually need that access to that variable later. So for example, as part of tic-tac-toe, you might have a subprogram that lets a player input their move. Okay, that spot will need to change on the board, but it needs to permanently change on the board. It can't just change in that subprogram. Okay, so in a couple of videos we're going to look at global and local variables, but just to give you kind of an idea right now, with global variables, they are defined throughout the entire program. So we say the scope is the whole program. We can use those wherever we want to in our program. With local variables, they are only defined inside this function or procedure that they're created in. So let's look at what that means. So we've got this long function. It takes in a as a parameter, and it does a whole bunch of calculations to our variable a. Okay, we call it at the end. So we call this with 5, and it's gonna, what is that gonna do? 50, 65, 650. So it's gonna give us 620. Okay, arbitrary function just to show what's happening. If I print a then on that next line, we get name a is not defined. Okay, we can see it's defined. We've got it as a parameter and we're setting equal, but what's happened is a is a local variable, so a is only defined in this function. Okay, outside the as soon as the function ends, a no longer exists. Okay, so what we do instead is we return a. Okay, and by returning a, we can then set a variable equal to that function. So here's our function call like we've had previously with 5. Now notice previously we just called it, but now we set a variable equal to it. And when we set that variable equal to it, whatever is returned is going to be saved in that variable, and then we can use it later on. So right here, we're just outputting it just so that we can see what's happening. But later on we might want to use it in another function, or we might want to check something about it, or we might want to write it to a file, or a whole host of things that we might want to do with that variable. Okay, so this is kind of how return values work. So we've previously looked at parameters, so that's our variable that we put into the subprogram. Return values are the value that's returned at the end so that we can use it outside of the subroutine. It will be the last line in your function because as soon as you return something, the function ends. So even if there were lines of code after that return, the function will end and those lines won't be run. So let's look at some examples. We want to write a function that takes in 2 parameters and returns the product. Calculate call the function with 3 and 5 and print the result. So we've got our product, we've got our parameters num1 and num2. We are calculating our product. Okay. Now I'm going to return our product, return p, and that means that whatever was calculated here can be used outside the subprogram. So here, when we call our function product, so we've got product, we're calling it with 3 and 5, so 3 is num1 and 5 is num2, but whatever is returned is going to be stored in this variable answer. Okay, and then we can print the result answer because that's what we've stored. We've stored the p product in that variable. Okay, so in this case it'll print 15. Let's look at another example. So we want to take in a number and return the cube of that number, but this time we want to call the function using input from the user. So we've got a cube, we pass in number as a parameter, we are finding the cube of that number, remember double asterisk is to the power of, and then we're going to return c. So we're not printing it inside of our function, we're returning it, and then outside of our function we're going to ask the user for the number to be inputted. We call the function cube with that number. Whatever is returned, that c, is going to be stored in the variable answer, and then we can output answer, or like I said, do whatever we need to do. Remember, these are quite small programs. In the real world, your programs are going to be a lot longer. And final example, we want to write a function that takes in a first name and surname and returns the user's initials. So very similar to what we did in the previous video, but here we are returning it instead of printing it. So we've got our function with parameters fn and sn. We find the initials, and we're going to return those initials this time. Okay, so then when we ask the user for their first name and surname and call that function, because there's a return value, that's going to be stored in the variable answer, and then we can again output it like we were doing previously. All right, let's look at some examples of this in live programming. So let's go ahead and do this one. So we're going to complete the function to return the total of a plus b, and then call it with 3 and 4 and print the result. So there's a couple ways we can do this. We can say total equals a plus b, and then we are going to return total. All right, let's go ahead and do this the long way. So we're going to create a variable called answer, and then we're going to call our function add with 3 and 4 as the values for our parameters, and then we are going to print answer. And if we run that, we get 7. Okay, so it's called the function, it returned total, so whatever was in total gets stored in the variable answer, and then it prints out the answer. Okay, just to show you how you can actually do this a bit more quickly, we can just go ahead and print add 3, 4, and whatever is in whatever it returns will be printed. So let's clear it. If we run it again, you can see 7 is outputted. Okay, the other thing that we could do this to make it a bit quicker, more efficient, is get rid of this variable total as well, and just return a plus b straight away, and we still get 7. Okay, all of these are very valid. All of them are correct. It is absolutely up to you how you want to do it. Okay, and that is kind of how functions work. Just to show you, if I'd forgotten to do this, if I'd forgotten to return, and if we print answer here, we get none. Okay, because nothing was returned, so that's what it does. So, but here we want to return total. Let's run our code, check our answer, and we are correct.